The steering wheel was cool beneath my palms, a stark contrast to the warmth radiating from the passenger footwell. Two pies, still fragrant from the oven, sat nestled in a cardboard box. One apple crumble, the other pumpkin. My pumpkin pie. The one David had called his favorite since he was a boy. The one he'd asked me to make just last week. "Nobody makes it like you, Mom," he'd said over the phone, his voice a familiar, comforting melody. Christmas wouldn't be Christmas without it. So, I'd baked. I'd spent the last 2 days baking, wrapping, and humming along to Bing Crosby, caught in the gentle, nostalgic whirlwind of the season. The trunk held a carefully curated collection of presents, each one chosen with thought and affection. A first-edition copy of a sci-fi classic for my son, David. A delicate silk scarf for his wife, Jessica. A new, top-of-the-line electric razor for my husband, Mark, who was already at their house, having gone over earlier to help with the heavy lifting. Their new house, the one we'd helped them with the down payment for, was nestled in a quiet suburban cul-de-sac. It was the picture of domestic bliss, especially now, with tasteful white lights tracing the roofline and a festive wreath on the cherry-red door. As I pulled into the driveway, my headlights swept across the familiar scene, illuminating a carved wooden snowman I'd given them last year. It stood guard by the porch, its painted smile a cheerful welcome. The digital clock on my dashboard glowed. 6:01 p.m. Right on time. "Come by 6 p.m., Mom," Jessica's text had read, complete with a little Christmas tree emoji. I gathered the pies, balancing the warm box carefully in my arms, and made my way up the flagstone path. The air was crisp and cold, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. I pressed the doorbell, its cheerful chime echoing the jingle bells on the radio I'd just turned off. I waited, shifting the weight of the pies. A minute passed. I could hear the faint, muffled sound of music from within, a low thrum of bass. Probably their holiday playlist. I pressed the bell again, holding it a little longer this time. Still nothing. A flicker of annoyance, quickly dismissed. They were probably in the back of the house, maybe dealing with the turkey. The music turned up too loud. I fumbled for my phone with one hand, the pie box digging into my arm, and called David. It rang, and then went to voicemail. "Hey, it's David. Leave a message." I tried Jessica. Same result. A prickle of unease started to form, a cold little knot in my stomach. I tried Mark. Straight to voicemail. That was odd. He never turned his phone off. I set the pies down on the porch swing, the cold wood a shock after their warmth, and walked to the front door, trying the handle. Locked. Of course it was locked, but still. My heart was starting to beat a little faster now. I knocked, my knuckles rapping sharply against the cold, solid wood. "Hello? David? It's me," I called out, my voice sounding thin and strange in the quiet street. The only answer was the rustle of dry leaves skittering across the lawn. This was ridiculous. They were expecting me. I had the pies. I had a trunk full of presents. A dozen scenarios ran through my head. A sudden emergency. A trip to the store for a forgotten ingredient. But wouldn't they have called? Wouldn't they have left a note? The unease was growing, blooming into a genuine, chilling dread. Something felt wrong. Deeply wrong. I backed away from the door, my boots crunching on the frosty grass. The large picture window to the left of the door, usually framed by open curtains, was mostly drawn. But there was a gap of about 6 inches, a dark vertical slash in the cream-colored fabric. Hesitantly, feeling like a spy, I crept towards it, my breath fogging in the cold air. I leaned in, my face close to the cold glass, and angled my head to peer through the opening. And the world stopped. It wasn't empty. It was full of light and laughter and my family. My son, David, was raising a glass of wine, his face split in a wide grin. Across the table, my husband, Mark, was laughing, his head tilted back in a way I knew so well. He was sitting next to a woman with silver hair, who was patting his arm affectionately. And next to David was Jessica, beaming, as she served a slice of turkey to a man who I vaguely recognized as her father. They were all there, my family and Jessica's family. The table was set with the good china, the one I'd given them as a wedding gift. In the center of the table, next to a festive floral arrangement, sat a pumpkin pie. It wasn't my pie. It was a store-bought pie in a tinfoil dish. The scene was a perfect Christmas portrait, a happy family gathered in warmth and celebration. And I was on the outside, in the freezing cold, staring through a crack in the curtains like a beggar. The pies I had carried so carefully suddenly felt like lead weights. The presents in the trunk felt like a collection of fool's treasures. It wasn't an emergency. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice. They had chosen to have a Christmas without me. They had replaced me. I stumbled back from the window, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a sound, a sob or a gasp. I couldn't breathe. The cold air burned my lungs. I saw it all with a horrifying crystalline clarity. The casual way Mark fit in with her parents, the way David's eyes only looked at Jessica, the complete and utter absence of any thought of me. I didn't exist in that room. I had been erased. I don't remember driving home. I remember the sensation of the cold steering wheel again, my knuckles white as I gripped it. I remember the blur of streetlights through a film of tears I didn't realize I was crying. When I got inside my own house, the silence was a physical blow. It was deafening. I left the presents in the car. I left the pies on my kitchen counter, their sweet scent now a nauseating mockery. I sank onto the sofa, the festive decorations around me, the tree Mark and I had decorated just last weekend, seeming like props from another woman's life. The self-blame began its insidious crawl. What had I done? Was I too overbearing? Did I call too often? Was my pie not as good as I thought? The questions looped, each one a small, sharp knife twisting in the wound. I had devoted my life to them, to Mark, to David. Every choice, every sacrifice had been for the good of my family, and they had locked the door and celebrated without me. Through the window, I saw my life as I knew it, and I saw that it was a lie. And in the silent, empty house, I felt myself begin to collapse, a building crumbling from the inside out, until nothing was left but a hollow, echoing ruin. The first 48 hours were a blur of gray. I didn't answer the phone, which rang with a sickening, cheerful persistence on Christmas Day, then less frequently the day after. I knew who it was. The caller ID would flash David or Mark, and I would just stare at the screen, a fresh wave of nausea rolling through me. What would they say? Would they lie? Would they feign ignorance? The thought of hearing their voices, laced with false concern, was more than I could bear. I moved through my house like a ghost, the silence broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the frantic, looping monologue in my own head. The uneaten pies on the counter grew stale, a monument to my foolishness. I eventually threw them in the trash, the sound of the lid closing feeling unnervously final. The initial shock, that raw, gaping wound of what I'd seen through the window, slowly began to scab over. And underneath it, something else started to form. A cold, hard clarity. The emotional pain was still there, a constant dull ache behind my ribs, but it was no longer all-consuming. My mind, against my will at first, started to work. It began to count the losses, to take inventory of the wreckage. It wasn't just a missed Christmas dinner. It was a meticulously planned exclusion. They didn't just forget to invite me. They actively conspired to keep me away. The 6 p.m. invitation was a lie, a tool to ensure I arrived at an empty, locked house to formalize my removal. Mark being there early to help wasn't to help David and Jessica. It was to ensure he was firmly on the inside when the door was locked. This awakening was not a sudden epiphany, but a slow, dawning horror. I started to look back, not with the rose-tinted glasses of a mother and wife, but with the cold, analytical eye of a detective investigating a crime. And the clues were everywhere. The little things I had dismissed as thoughtlessness or generational differences now clicked into place as deliberate acts of separation. The family group chat that had grown strangely quiet over the past few months. The vague, non-committal answers Mark would give when I asked about his day. The way Jessica would subtly correct my stories about David's childhood, as if rewriting his history to exclude me. The biggest loss, the one that made it hard to breathe, was Mark. 30 years. 30 years of shared mornings, inside jokes, and weathered storms. I had believed we were a team, but as I sat in the crushing silence of our home, I realized he had switched jerseys and joined the opposing side. The betrayal wasn't just that he was at that dinner. It was that he had helped plan it. He had woken up next to me that morning, wished me a Merry Christmas, and watched me pack the pies into the car, knowing full well where I was going and what I would find. He had chosen them. He had chosen Jessica's family over his own. That realization was the catalyst. It was the point of transition. The emotional pain, the grief for the family I thought I had, began to crystallize into something else. It became a hard, cold resolve. It was no longer about what I had done wrong. It was about what had been done to me. I walked into our home office, a room I'd rarely used, and turned on the desktop computer. I started looking. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I trusted my instincts. I opened our shared credit card statements. There they were. Dozens of small charges I didn't recognize. Lunches for 4 at restaurants near Jessica's parents' home. Tickets to a concert I'd mentioned wanting to go to, but Mark had claimed were sold out. A charge from a jewelry store in a neighboring town, dated 2 weeks before Christmas. I had received no jewelry. Jessica, in the glimpse I'd had through the window, had been wearing a new glittering necklace. Then I found the emails. Mark wasn't tech-savvy. He never cleared his trash folder. There was a chain between him and David from a month ago. The subject line was holiday plans. David wrote about how Jessica's parents were so much more relaxed and how it would be easier for everyone if they just had a quiet Christmas with them. Mark's reply was what shattered the last vestiges of my hope. "I agree," he wrote. "Helen gets a bit much with all her traditions. Let's just tell her 6 p.m. and we'll be done with dinner by then. What she doesn't know won't hurt her. What she doesn't know won't hurt her." The words burned on the screen. There it was, in black and white, premeditated, callous. My pain wasn't a byproduct of their holiday plans. It was a calculated and acceptable casualty. The self-blame vanished, incinerated by a white-hot rage. I was not a victim of circumstance. I was the target of a conspiracy. That was the moment the bond broke. It wasn't a snap, but a slow, deliberate severing of a cable that had anchored me for 3 decades. I picked up my phone and called a 24-hour locksmith. An hour later, under the cold glare of the porch light, a man was drilling out the locks on my front and back doors. The sound was loud, violent, and strangely satisfying. It was the sound of my old life being dismantled. I packed a bag for Mark. I folded his clothes neatly the way he liked them. I included his new electric razor, still in its box. I placed the bag by the new gleaming lock on the front door. I felt nothing. No sadness, no nostalgia. Just a profound and chilling calm. He arrived the next afternoon, his key scraping uselessly against the new lock. He knocked, then banged his fist on the door. I watched him on the security camera I'd had installed that morning. Finally, I opened the door, but only a few inches, leaving the chain on. His face was a mixture of confusion and irritation. "Helen? What the hell is going on? I couldn't get in." I looked at him, at the man I had shared my life with, and I saw a stranger. The calm I felt was absolute. There was no room for hysteria, no energy for screaming. For the first time, I was choosing myself, and that choice left no space for his drama. "Your things are in the bag, Mark," I said, my voice even and steady. "I know about the dinner. I know about the emails. We're done." His face fell. The irritation was replaced by a flicker of panic. "Helen, wait. We can talk about this. It was a misunderstanding." "No," I said, and the word was as solid and unmoving as the door between us. "It was a very clear understanding. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. Goodbye, Mark." I closed the door on his sputtering protests, sliding the deadbolt home. The click was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of the rest of my life beginning. For a few days, the silence returned, but it was a different kind. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of grief, but the clean, empty silence of a slate wiped clean. I spent the time methodically, almost robotically, beginning the process of untangling my life from Mark's. I made lists. I sorted paperwork. I felt a strange sense of purpose, a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. The emotional storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape that was barren but solid. I was standing on my own ground. The invasion, when it came, was not subtle. It was a full frontal assault. A week after I had locked Mark out, a car I didn't recognize, a sleek and aggressively modern SUV, pulled into my driveway. I watched from the kitchen window as my son, David, emerged from the passenger side, his face set in a grim, determined line. Then Jessica got out of the driver's seat. She smoothed down her expensive-looking coat, a portrait of composure, but I could see the tightness in her jaw even from a distance. They marched up the walkway not like family coming to visit, but like soldiers on a mission. I had a choice. I could ignore the doorbell, pretend I wasn't home. But that was the old Helen, the new Helen, the one forged in the cold outside their Christmas window, knew that you couldn't hide from a fight that had already been brought to your doorstep. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and opened the door. "We need to talk," David said, foregoing any greeting. He tried to step inside, but I didn't move. I stood firm in the doorway, my body a physical barrier. "There's nothing to talk about, David," I replied, my tone level. "Don't be ridiculous, Mom," he scoffed, an edge of anger in his voice. "You kicked Dad out. You changed the locks. What is wrong with you?" It was then that Jessica stepped forward, placing a placating hand on David's arm, a practiced gesture of a puppet master calming her charge. She smiled at me, a sweet, saccharine smile that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. "Helen," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "We were so worried. When you didn't answer our calls. We just wanted a quiet Christmas. You know how stressful things have been. We thought you'd understand." The manipulation was so blatant, so insulting in its transparency, that I almost laughed. They weren't here out of concern. They were here for damage control. My actions, changing the locks, kicking Mark out, had disrupted their neat little plan of quietly phasing me out. I had refused to play the part of the fading, forgotten matriarch. I had become a problem to be managed. "I understand perfectly, Jessica," I said, my gaze steady on hers. "I understand that you, my son, and my husband planned to deceive me. I understand that you sat down to a celebratory dinner while I stood outside in the cold. What part of that do you think I would understand?" David's face flushed with anger. "See? This is what I'm talking about. You're always so dramatic. You take everything and blow it completely out of proportion. You're ruining this family." The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. I was ruining the family. Not the son who conspired against his mother, not the husband who betrayed his wife of 30 years. Me, the woman who baked the pies, the woman who stood on the wrong side of the window. The gaslighting was breathtaking in its audacity. They were attempting to rewrite reality, to paint me as the villain in a story where I was the primary victim. Jessica took over again, her voice soft and treacherous. "All we wanted was one holiday with my parents. It's not fair that we always have to cater to your traditions, your schedule. David is my husband now, Helen. His priority is our new family. And honestly, your behavior lately has been difficult. You've been very needy." Needy. The word was a slap in the face. All those calls to check in, all those offers to babysit a hypothetical future grandchild, all those home-cooked meals delivered to their door, all of it was being reframed as a symptom of my suffocating neediness. They were systematically dismantling my identity as a caring mother and recasting me as a mentally unstable burden. Then came the threats, veiled in the language of concern. "You need to think about the future, Mom," David said, his voice lowering into a more menacing register. "If you continue down this path, pushing Dad away, pushing us away, well, you'll be very lonely. When we have kids, do you think we'll want to bring them around someone so unstable? You'll never see your grandchildren." That was their trump card, the one they believed would break me. The dream of being a grandmother was something I had spoken of often, a future joy I had held close to my heart. They were taking that dream and turning it into a weapon, a tool of extortion. They believed I would crumble, that I would apologize for my own pain just to be allowed back into their lives on their terms. But looking at their faces, at my son's petulant anger and my daughter-in-law's smug superiority, I felt no desire to be part of their world. The dream of grandchildren soured, tainted by the cruelty of the parents they would have. The image of a happy family had been a mirage, and now that the illusion was shattered, I had no desire to crawl back into the desert and pretend it was real. They weren't just rivals who had invaded my home. They were strangers wearing the faces of people I had once loved. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I could not let them win. I would not let them rewrite my story. The threat of a lonely, grandchildless future hung in the cold January air between us. It was their checkmate move, the one they were sure would send me scurrying back into my designated box of compliance. I could see it in David's eyes, a flicker of victory, the assumption that he had found my breaking point. I could see it in Jessica's subtle, self-satisfied smirk, They waited for the tears, the apologies, the pleas for forgiveness. They waited for the old Helen to reemerge. But the old Helen was gone. She had frozen to death on their perfectly manicured lawn on Christmas Eve. The woman standing in the doorway now was someone else entirely, a stranger, even to myself. I let the silence stretch, watching their confidence waver as I failed to produce the expected emotional collapse. My calmness was my new armor, and it was deflecting their attacks more effectively than any shouted defense could have. When I finally spoke, my voice was quiet, devoid of the tremor they anticipated. "Is that all?" I asked. The simple question threw them off. David blinked. "What? Mom, did you hear what I said? About the kids?" "I heard you," I replied, my gaze unblinking. "You are threatening to withhold your hypothetical children from me unless I accept your and your father's betrayal and deceit. Is that a fair summary?" Phrased so bluntly, their manipulation sounded as ugly and calculating as it truly was. David floundered, his face reddening. "No, that's not. We're just saying you're pushing us away with this behavior." "My behavior," I repeated, the words tasting like iron. "My behavior is a reaction to your actions. You seem to be confusing cause and effect. You built the fire, David. I am simply refusing to stand in it and pretend I'm not getting burned." Jessica, ever the strategist, tried a different angle. She stepped closer, attempting to create an illusion of intimacy, of a woman-to-woman chat. "Helen, please," she murmured, trying to inject a note of sympathy into her voice. "We can see you're hurting, but you're punishing Mark for one little mistake. He loves you. He's miserable without you. Can't you find it in your heart to forgive him?" The appeal to my sense of marital duty, to my compassion, was a well-worn path they expected me to take. For 30 years, I had been the peacemaker, the one who forgave, the one who smoothed things over for the sake of family harmony. But the woman they were talking to now valued her own dignity more than a fractured, dishonest peace. "What you're asking for isn't forgiveness, Jessica," I said, my voice hardening slightly. "It's permission. You want my permission to treat me poorly. You want me to sign off on your bad behavior so you can have what you want: my husband's financial support, a compliant mother-in-law on the sidelines, without any of the guilt. The answer is no." I paused, letting the finality of the words sink in. My heart, as you put it, is no longer a part of this negotiation. A flicker of genuine shock crossed Jessica's face. She was not used to being spoken to this way, to having her motives dissected and laid bare. She had underestimated me, viewing me not as a person, but as an obstacle, and she had misjudged the obstacle's resilience. My defiance seemed to finally break through David's self-righteous anger, touching a nerve of pure rage. "I can't believe you," he spat, his voice rising. "After everything Dad has done for you, everything I've done. We gave you a family. We let you be a part of our lives, and this is how you repay us? With this insane, selfish drama?" The sheer, staggering narcissism of his statement was what finally cemented my resolve. They gave me a family? They let me be a part of their lives? It was a complete inversion of reality. I was the one who had rocked him to sleep, who had packed his lunches, who had celebrated his every minor victory and soothed his every small defeat. My life's work, my love, my labor, all of it was being erased and repackaged as a gift they had bestowed upon me. I felt a cold calm settle over me, a profound and unshakable certainty. I was not just fighting for a fair divorce settlement or for my own dignity. I was fighting for my very existence, for the truth of my own life against their poisonous, self-serving narrative. "I think you should go now," I said. It was not a request. It was a command. "We're not leaving until you see sense," David blustered, puffing out his chest. "Yes, you are," I said, and I reached for the phone on the hall table. "You can either walk to your car or you can wait for the police to escort you. Trespassing is still a crime, I believe. The choice is yours." I held my son's gaze. For a moment, I saw the little boy I used to know, lost and angry, but it was overshadowed by the man he had become, a weak, cruel stranger who was a pawn in his wife's game. He searched my face for a bluff, for a sign of the mother who would never, ever call the police on her own son. He found none. Jessica grabbed his arm, her carefully constructed composure finally cracking. "David, let's go," she hissed, pulling him toward the walkway. "She's lost her mind." He allowed himself to be pulled away, but not before firing one last shot over his shoulder. "You'll regret this. You'll die alone, you crazy old woman." The words, meant to be a curse, landed with no impact. I watched them get back into their shiny, expensive car and speed away, leaving a trail of disturbed gravel in their wake. I closed the door, slid the deadbolt, and leaned against the solid wood. I was shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the confrontation. They had come to my home to break me, to intimidate me back into submission. They had failed. The invasion had been repelled. And in the ensuing silence, I realized a crucial truth. Loneliness was not being in an empty house. Loneliness was being in a room full of people who saw you as an inconvenience, an object to be managed. Being alone, I was beginning to discover, felt a lot like being free. The confrontation on my doorstep was a baptism by fire. David's final venomous words, "crazy old woman," echoed not as an insult, but as a clarification. That was their strategy, to paint me as unhinged, an unreliable narrator in the story of my own life. If I was crazy, then my pain was invalid. If I was hysterical, then their actions were justified. It was a classic textbook maneuver to discredit and isolate a victim, and it was not going to work. The adrenaline from our encounter soon subsided, replaced by a steely, focused determination. They had declared war. It was time for me to stop playing defense and start building a fortress. The lists I had been making, the papers I had been sorting, these were no longer just therapeutic exercises. They were the gathering of ammunition. The next morning, I made an appointment with a lawyer. I didn't just pick a name from a phone book. I spent hours researching, reading reviews, looking for someone who specialized in contentious divorces and, specifically, financial forensics. I found a woman named Eleanor Vance, a senior partner at a downtown firm with a reputation for being as sharp as a shard of glass. Her online bio was concise and formidable. It was exactly what I needed. Walking into her polished mahogany and leather office 2 days later felt like crossing a significant threshold. It was the first time I was going to tell the entire story, from beginning to end, to a complete stranger. I had brought a meticulously organized binder with me. It contained printouts of the emails between Mark and David, the annotated credit card statements highlighting the suspicious charges, and a detailed timeline of events as I remembered them. Eleanor Vance was in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She didn't offer platitudes or tissues. She listened, her pen occasionally scratching a note on a yellow legal pad. I told her everything: the pies, the locked door, the scene through the window, Mark's complicity, the confrontation with David and Jessica, their accusations of me being needy and unstable, and their final threat about the grandchildren. I laid it all out, my voice steady, my presentation factual. I was not a hysterical woman telling a story of hurt feelings. I was a client presenting a case. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the binder I had pushed across the desk toward her. "Well, Helen," she said finally, her voice crisp and professional. "They're not very original, are they?" Her calm, almost bored assessment was more comforting than any expression of sympathy would have been. She had seen this before. This was a pattern, a playbook. I wasn't crazy. I was a cliché. "Their goal is twofold," she continued, steepling her fingers. "First, to secure the assets. Your husband has likely been siphoning funds for some time, probably at the direction of your son and daughter-in-law, to create a new financial reality for himself post-divorce. Second, to break you down psychologically so you accept a lowball settlement and go away quietly. The crazy narrative is designed to make you doubt yourself and to alienate anyone who might support you." Hearing my chaotic, painful experience so clinically dissected was profoundly validating. It was real. It had a name. It was a strategy. "So, what do we do?" I asked. "We take control of the narrative," Eleanor said, a hint of a smile touching her lips. "And we turn off the money tap. Immediately." That was the moment my decision to defend myself solidified into concrete action. Following Eleanor's precise instructions, we spent the next hour making a series of phone calls. The first was to the bank. I used my legal authority as a co-owner of our accounts to place an immediate freeze on all joint savings and investment portfolios. No funds could be withdrawn by either party without a court order or mutual written consent. I imagined Mark at an ATM, his card being rejected, and felt a grim satisfaction. The flow of money to his new life, a life built on my share of our shared future, had just been damned. The second call was to our financial advisor. I informed him of the situation and that Eleanor Vance would now be my sole legal representative in all matters. I instructed him to compile a complete history of all transactions, transfers, and withdrawals from our investment accounts going back 5 years. Eleanor suspected Mark and David might have been more ambitious than just fancy dinners and jewelry. The final step that day was the most significant. Eleanor drafted and filed the initial divorce petition. The grounds were not irreconcilable differences, but something stronger: financial dissipation and fraudulent conduct. We weren't just ending a marriage, we were launching a counteroffensive. The petition included a motion for a forensic accountant to be appointed by the court to investigate the full extent of Mark's spending and the potential funneling of marital assets. I walked out of her office into the bright afternoon sun, feeling lighter than I had in months. The knot of helpless victimhood in my stomach had been replaced by something solid and powerful: a plan. I had taken my pain, my humiliation, and my anger, and I had handed them to a professional who was now sharpening them into a weapon. I had spent my entire adult life building a home, raising a son, and supporting a husband. My identity was interwoven with theirs. They had tried to tear that identity down, to leave me with nothing. But they had miscalculated. In trying to erase me, they had inadvertently forced me to build a new identity from scratch, on a foundation of my own strength. The first action wasn't just freezing a bank account or filing a legal document. It was the act of hiring Eleanor Vance, of taking my story seriously, of deciding that I was worth defending. It was the first day I truly started to fight for myself. The financial freeze and the official divorce filing had the effect of kicking a hornet's nest. The immediate silence from their end was deafening and, I knew, temporary. They were regrouping, reeling from the shock that the crazy old woman had not, in fact, curled up into a ball of tears, but had instead hired a barracuda of a lawyer and cut off their allowance. The silence lasted for 10 days. I used the time to continue my work, digging through old files, finding receipts and documents I had long forgotten, each one a small piece of the life Mark and I had built, a life he had been secretly dismantling. The next move in their game was not an attack, but a feigned retreat. It was a classic pincer movement, executed with a cloying, desperate insincerity. The first arm of the attack came from Mark. He appeared on my doorstep one evening, unannounced. He looked haggard. The confident, laughing man from the Christmas window was gone, replaced by a stooped, anxious figure. He was holding a bouquet of supermarket roses, already slightly wilted. I spoke to him through the closed door, my voice amplified by the intercom system I'd had installed. "What do you want, Mark?" "Helen, please," he said, his voice tinny and pathetic through the small speaker. "Let me in. We need to talk. This has all gone too far. All communications are to go through my lawyer. You know that." "I don't want to talk to the lawyers," he pleaded. "I want to talk to my wife. Helen, I made a mistake. A terrible, stupid mistake. I let them get in my head. Jessica, David, they twisted things. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I miss you. I miss our home." It was a performance worthy of the stage. Every word was calibrated to appeal to the 30 years we had shared, to the memory of the woman he thought I still was. He was painting himself as the victim, a man led astray by younger, more manipulative minds. He was offering me the role of the magnanimous, forgiving wife who would welcome her straying husband back into the fold, who would call off the lawyers and restore the comfortable status quo. He thought I was weak, that my love for the idea of our marriage would be stronger than my respect for myself. "You're not miserable because you miss me, Mark," I said, my voice as cold and clear as the glass of the window I was looking through. "You're miserable because the bank accounts are frozen. You made your choice on Christmas Eve. That choice has consequences." "It's not about the money," he insisted, his voice cracking with frustration. "It's about us. I love you. If you loved me, you wouldn't have been able to eat your dinner that night, knowing where I was," I replied. "Your apology is about a month too late and several $100,000 short. Goodbye, Mark. Tell your lawyer to expect a package from mine." I cut the intercom connection, leaving him standing on the porch with his sad, wilting flowers. The temptation was non-existent. It was like watching a stranger in a movie I had no interest in seeing. The second arm of the pincer movement came a few days later, this time from David. A phone call from a number I didn't recognize. I answered cautiously. "Mom?" The single word was infused with a theatrical, childlike vulnerability. The angry, entitled man who had cursed me on my lawn was gone, replaced by the prodigal son. "Hello, David," I said, my tone neutral. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he said, and I could hear the manufactured tremor in his voice. "I don't know what I was thinking. I've been a terrible son. Jessica and we've been fighting. She doesn't understand. She doesn't understand what you mean to me." Here it was. The attempt to drive a wedge between me and Jessica, to reposition himself as my ally against the evil daughter-in-law. He was trying to appeal to the primal bond of mother and son, hoping I would see him as my misguided boy who had simply fallen under the spell of a wicked woman. "We miss you, Mom," he went on, his voice thick with fake emotion. "Christmas wasn't the same. Nothing is. Can we please just put all this legal stuff behind us? We're family. We can work this out. Just the three of us. You, me, and Dad. Like it used to be. The temptation this time was more insidious. He wasn't just offering a return to the status quo. He was offering a return to a past that had never truly existed, a fantasy of a happy, united family. He was offering to excise Jessica from the equation, sacrificing her to appease me. It was a testament to his desperation and his breathtaking lack of character. He was willing to throw his own wife under the bus to regain control of the situation and, more importantly, the family finances. But I was no longer the sentimental mother who would fall for such a ploy. I saw the maneuver for what it was, a desperate gambit from a losing player. My rejection was as cold and mature as the one I had given his father. "David," I said, and my voice was devoid of warmth. "The time for working it out passed when you and your father conspired to humiliate me. You showed me exactly what your family looks like. It is not something I have any interest in being a part of. You made your bed with Jessica. I suggest you lie in it." "But Mom," he started. "Do not call me again," I interrupted, the words sharp and final. "From this point forward, if you have something to say, you can say it in a deposition." I hung up the phone before he could reply. I felt no triumph, no anger, not even sadness. I felt a profound sense of detachment. They were enemies, and they had presented me with a poisoned chalice disguised as an olive branch. They had tempted me with a return to a life that was a lie, a life that required my silence and my submission. My rejection was not born of anger, but of clarity. I was no longer interested in playing a part in their drama. I was the director of my own story now, and in my story, the villains did not get a redemption arc. They simply got what they deserved. After repelling the clumsy, insincere attempts at reconciliation, I understood that the legal battle ahead would be a long and draining war of attrition. Mark and David, guided by Jessica's venom, would not give up easily. They would try to wear me down, to bleed me dry emotionally and financially. Eleanor Vance could handle the legal strategy, but I knew I needed to build my own personal reserves of strength. I could not fight this war alone from inside the silent walls of my house. My first step toward finding support was a difficult one. It involved swallowing my pride and reaching out to my old college friend, Carol. We had been close for years, but in the decade since David had married Jessica, I had let the friendship drift. Our phone calls became less frequent, our lunches postponed and eventually forgotten. The truth, I now admitted to myself, was that I had been embarrassed. Carol had never liked Jessica. She had once described her as having the eyes of a tax auditor, a comment I had dismissed at the time as cynical. Carol had seen the calculated ambition in Jessica that I, blinded by a mother's hope, had refused to acknowledge. I had chosen to retreat from Carol's clear-eyed perception rather than confront the uncomfortable truth about my son's choice of a partner. Making that call was an act of surrender to the truth. When she answered, her voice was warm, with no hint of, "I told you so." I asked if we could meet for coffee, and an hour later, we were sitting in a quiet cafe, a place we used to frequent. I told her everything. I didn't hold back or try to soften the edges of my son's cruelty or my husband's betrayal. I laid the ugliness of it all out on the table between us. She listened without interruption, her expression a mixture of anger on my behalf and deep compassion. When I finished, she reached across the table and put her hand over mine. "Helen," she said, her voice firm, "welcome back. I've missed you." In that moment, I felt a profound sense of recognition. She understood. She told me about her own sister's divorce from a man who had secretly opened a second line of credit in her name, a story I had only known the vague outlines of. We talked for 2 hours, not just about our respective betrayals, but about the subtle ways we, as women of our generation, had been conditioned to put the needs of our families first, to be the peacemakers, the absorbers of conflict, often to our own detriment. It was a revelation. My situation wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was part of a larger, shared female experience. I wasn't just a scorned wife. I was a woman waking up to a lifetime of quiet sacrifices. I left that cafe feeling less alone than I had in years. I had an ally. My search for connection led me online. I found a private forum, a website with a bland, anonymous name, Phoenix Project. It was a support group for women over 50 navigating high-conflict divorces, often involving financial abuse and family alienation. Reading the stories posted by other women was like reading pages from my own diary. The specifics were different. Some dealt with infidelity, others with addiction, but the emotional core was identical. They wrote about the gaslighting, the weaponization of children and grandchildren, the shock of discovering a secret financial life, the pain of being discarded after decades of service to a family. I started as a lurker, just reading. Then, one night, I wrote my own post. I told my story, starting with the title. They told me to come at 6 p.m. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of women from across the country replied. The locked door is a classic, one wrote. It's about demonstrating their power to exclude you. Another commented, the "you're being dramatic" line is step 1 in the gaslighter's handbook. This was more than just sympathy. It was mutual recognition. They saw me. They validated my reality. My pain was not a symptom of my instability. It was a rational response to a profound betrayal. These anonymous women became a lifeline, a Greek chorus confirming that I was not crazy and I was not alone. This newfound external support fueled a desire for internal, spiritual cleansing. My home, once a sanctuary, still felt haunted by the ghosts of my old life. Mark's presence lingered in the recliner he always sat in. David's childhood photos on the mantelpiece felt like a mockery. I needed to reclaim the space, to make it entirely my own. So I began the purge. It was a ritual of liberation. I rented a large dumpster and started with the attic. Boxes of Mark's old college textbooks, his fishing gear, clothes he hadn't worn in 20 years, all of it went in. Then, the hardest part, David's room. It had been kept as a sort of shrine since he'd left for college. I packed away the sentimental things, his first baseball glove, a few favorite books, into a single box. The rest, the faded posters, the trophies, the old clothes, I threw away. I was not erasing my son from my memory, but I was dismantling the monument to a relationship that no longer existed. The final act was the living room. I took down all the old family photos, the staged portraits of a happy family that was a lie. The walls were suddenly bare, scarred with pale rectangles where the frames had hung. The room felt empty, but it was a clean, promising emptiness. I rearranged the furniture, bought new cushions in bright, vibrant colors I loved, but Mark had always found too loud. I bought a ridiculous, oversized art print of a field of sunflowers and hung it where the main family portrait used to be. Each box thrown away, each picture taken down, was an act of severing a tie to the past. It was a spiritual cleansing, a way of physically manifesting the internal changes I was undergoing. I was gaining strength, not just from the support of others, but from my own actions. I was no longer just the woman who had been locked out. I was the woman who was cleaning house, literally and figuratively, preparing the space for a new life to begin. The support from Carol and the women of the Phoenix Project had transformed me. I was no longer just reacting to the moves made by Mark and his allies. I was ready to launch my own offensive. The initial legal filings had been defensive, a way to staunch the bleeding. Now it was time to go on the attack, to seek not just a fair division of assets, but justice for the deliberate and calculated financial deception. My new attack began in Eleanor Vance's office. Armed with the documents I had unearthed and the strength I had gained, we plotted the next phase. The forensic accountant we had hired had been working diligently, and his preliminary report was damning. He had uncovered a pattern of systematic withdrawals and transfers from our joint investment accounts to a separate account in Mark's name only. It wasn't just a few $1,000s for a necklace. It was over $200,000, siphoned off over the course of 3 years. The money trail led to 2 places: a brokerage account in David's name and direct payments toward the down payment on the very house from which I had been excluded. This was the smoking gun. It was no longer a case of a husband being financially irresponsible. This was a conspiracy between a father and son to defraud a wife and mother of her rightful share of the marital estate. It was calculated, long-term theft. "This changes the game," Eleanor said, a grim satisfaction in her eyes. "We are no longer just arguing about alimony. We are now in a position to claw back every single dollar they stole, plus legal fees. We will file a motion to introduce this evidence and amend our petition to include a claim for civil fraud." The new attack was multi-pronged. First, Eleanor filed the amended petition. A legal bomb dropped directly into their camp. The documents laid out in excruciating detail, with account numbers and transaction dates, the full extent of their scheme. There was no room for ambiguity, no way to dismiss it as a misunderstanding. Second, we initiated the discovery process with a vengeance. We sent out subpoenas for David and Jessica's personal bank records. We sent a subpoena to Jessica's parents asking for documentation regarding any large financial gifts they may have received from Mark. We were drawing a net, not just around Mark, but around the entire conspiracy. We wanted to see how far the rot had spread. The resistance from their side was immediate and ferocious. Their lawyer, a blustering man whose strategy seemed to consist mainly of loud indignation, filed motion after motion to try and block our subpoenas, claiming they were a vindictive fishing expedition. The court denied them all. The pressure on them was mounting, and their carefully constructed world was beginning to fracture. The resistance also took a more personal, uglier turn. They began a campaign of social warfare. I started hearing whispers from mutual acquaintances. Stories were being spread that I had a spending problem, that I was mentally unstable and had been for years, that my erratic behavior had driven my loving husband and son away. They were trying to poison the well, to discredit me in the eyes of anyone who might listen, hoping to isolate me completely. One afternoon, I ran into an old neighbor, a woman named Susan, at the grocery store. She looked at me with an expression of pity and discomfort. "Helen, dear," she said, lowering her voice, "I heard about your troubles. If you ever need to talk, Mark is just so worried about your state of mind." The old Helen would have been mortified, would have stammered a defense or hurried away in shame. The new Helen simply smiled a cool, serene smile. "Susan, thank you for your concern," I said, my voice pleasant and firm. "But you should know that worry is the word people use when they can't legally use the word guilt," I'm doing just fine. You have a lovely day. I pushed my cart away, leaving her standing stunned in the canned goods aisle. My resistance was my refusal to engage with their narrative. I did not defend myself against the rumors. I did not call people to set the record straight. I simply lived my life with a newfound confidence. I continued meeting with Carol. I attended a local gardening club. I started volunteering at the library. I was visible, I was calm, and I was, by all appearances, perfectly sane. My composure was a more powerful rebuttal to their lies than any angry denial could ever be. The most intense moment of resistance came during the depositions. We sat in a sterile conference room, a long table separating me from Mark, David, and Jessica. Their lawyer was aggressive, trying to paint me as a clueless, spendthrift housewife who had no understanding of her own finances. "Mrs. Miller," he began, "isn't it true that you left all financial matters to your husband?" "I trusted my husband," I corrected him calmly. "There is a significant difference. Isn't it true that you often overspent on frivolous things, on decorating, on gifts?" "Isn't it true, counsel," Eleanor interjected smoothly, "that your client transferred over $50,000 to his son's brokerage account without his wife's knowledge? Let's talk about what's truly frivolous." I resisted their attempts to fluster me, to twist my words. When it was David's turn, he couldn't look me in the eye. He mumbled his answers, his lies transparent and weak. Jessica sat beside him, a statue of righteous indignation, but I could see the panic in her eyes. The net was closing, and they were trapped in it, tangled in the web of their own greed and deceit. I resisted the urge to feel pity. I resisted the urge to feel rage. I felt nothing but the cold, clear conviction of my cause. They had started this war, but I was going to finish it. Faced with irrefutable evidence of fraud and a protagonist who refused to be broken, the opposition made one final, desperate attack. It was a move born not of strategy, but of pure, vindictive panic. They forged a document. It was a crude attempt, a supposed post-nuptial agreement from a decade prior, allegedly signed by me, that granted Mark sole control over all investment accounts. The signature was a clumsy imitation of my own, the language stilted and suspicious. Their lawyer presented it with a flourish, a last-ditch effort to invalidate our entire case. This was the attack that sealed their fate. It was an act of such brazen criminality that it went beyond the scope of a mere divorce proceeding. Eleanor Vance, upon seeing the document, barely suppressed a smile. She immediately requested a forensics expert to analyze the signature and the paper itself. The results came back within a week. The signature was a forgery, and the ink was less than 6 months old. They had not only committed fraud against me, but now also against the court. The defeat of my rivals was not a single dramatic courtroom scene, but a swift and brutal collapse. Faced with perjury charges and a civil fraud lawsuit they could not possibly win, their entire front crumbled. Their lawyer quit. Mark, stripped of all leverage, was forced to accept a settlement that was not just unfavorable, but punitive. He had to repay the entire $200,000 he had stolen, with interest. He had to pay for all my legal fees. What was left of the marital assets was divided in a way that heavily favored me, as compensation for the fraud. He was left with a mountain of debt and a ruined reputation. The fallout for David and Jessica was just as severe. The subpoena of their bank records had revealed that the stolen money from me was the foundation of their entire lifestyle: the SUV, the house, the designer clothes. Without the steady infusion of cash from Mark, Their precarious financial world imploded. They were forced to sell the house, the scene of my Christmas Eve humiliation, at a loss. The pressure, combined with the public disgrace of the fraud allegations, was too much for their shallow, transaction-based relationship to bear. As I had predicted, Jessica saw no value in a husband who could no longer provide for her ambitions. She filed for divorce from David, taking him for every last cent she could, leaving him broke and living in a small, rented apartment. My victory was absolute and without compromise. I made sure of it. There were no last-minute concessions, no sentimental gestures of forgiveness. I took what I was legally and morally owed, and I severed all ties. I sold the family home, the one filled with too many ghosts, and used the proceeds to buy a beautiful, light-filled condominium in a different part of the city, one with a balcony overlooking a park. My new life began. It wasn't a whirlwind of exotic travel or dramatic romance. It was something far more precious. It was peaceful. I reconnected with Carol and other old friends. I joined a hiking club and discovered a love for the quiet solitude of the mountains. I took a pottery class, finding immense satisfaction in creating something beautiful with my own hands. My life was my own, its rhythms dictated by my own desires, not by the needs and demands of a husband or a son. I was not lonely. I was blissfully, contentedly solitary. The happiness I found was quiet, steady, and profound. About a year after the settlement, as I was sitting on my balcony enjoying a cup of coffee in the morning sun, an email notification popped up on my laptop. The sender's name was David Miller. The subject line read, "I'm so sorry." Curiosity, a faint echo of an old instinct, compelled me to open it. It was a long, rambling message filled with self-pity. He wrote about how hard his life was, how Jessica had left him, how he had lost his job. He wrote that he finally understood how much he had hurt me, how he missed his mother, how he dreamed of a day we could be a family again. It was a pathetic plea for absolution, and perhaps for a financial bailout. He was still the same weak, selfish boy, looking for a mother to clean up his mess. I read the words on the screen, feeling nothing. No anger, no sadness, not even a flicker of pity. He was a stranger to me now, a character from a book I had finished reading long ago. The story was over. I moved my cursor over the email. I didn't send a reply. I didn't even read it to the end. I simply clicked the delete button. A small confirmation box popped up. "Are you sure you want to permanently delete this message?" I clicked yes. The message vanished. I took a sip of my coffee. The sun was warm on my face, and in the park below, I could hear the sound of children laughing. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, not in sadness or regret, but in pure, unadulterated peace. I was free.